think the problem that we're at, and this is the problem that Wahba identifies, that there's one school of thought that kind of dominated and has been um, dealt with as the one representative of Islam or Islamic philosophy.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. It is October the 8th today, 2023, and this is episode 8 of the De Facto podcast. I'm Anthony Ballas, of course, and I'm here with the great Robert K. Beshara. He is the Associate Professor of Psychology and Humanities and the Chair of Arts and Human Sciences at Northern New Mexico College, which is where I actually work as well. Robert is an author and editor of several books, including Decolonial Psychoanalysis Towards Critical Islamophobia Studies with Routledge. That was from 2019. Freud and Said, which I actually have right here. Contrapuntal Psychoanalysis as Liberation Praxis from Palgrave in 2021. He is the editor of Critical Introduction to Psychology with Nova from 2019 and Critical Psychology Praxis, Psychosocial Non-Alignment to Modernity / Coloniality. That's from Routledge 2021. And finally, the subject of today's discussion, Fundamentalism and Secularization, which Robert translated in 2022, published by Bloomsbury. This is Mourad Wahba's classic book from 1995. Robert is also a playwright, a multi-genre musician, a filmmaker, and perhaps above all else, if he'll allow me to say so, one of the most generous and thoughtful academics, really one of the most thoughtful and generous people I think I've ever met. So Robert, welcome to De Facto. I have been waiting for you to come on actually for such a long time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I really appreciate it, and it's such an honor to be on your podcast, especially knowing that it's been dedicated to Professor Gerald Horne, who is like an eminent historian. So I'm aware of my inclusion, obviously, junior scholar in comparison to him, but like it's very humbling to say the least.
So. Thank you, and our listeners and viewers will be aware that you're the first non-Horne interview. So there's kind of a moment here that we should relish. I think that
yes,
but it is a testament.
I'm aware of it, yeah, and I appreciate it. Yeah,
it's a testament to I think who you are and your work, and you're really if this word is acceptable to you, is a kind of a Renaissance person. You really you combine scholarship, research, aesthetics, psychoanalysis, clinical stuff. I mean, you really do a lot, and I think
it does take a toll on me, but yeah, I mean, I think it's the problem of having many interests and enjoying many things.
Absolutely. Well, you seem to be doing well, and I think that you're well equipped to be able to handle all of that, all of those interests.
At least I seem that way. So, but I do have my off days.
Sure. Well, if you have any off days, I don't think we've ever seen any of them. So let's talk a little bit about this translation.
Yeah.
Just briefly, let me just say that fundamentalism and secularization is, in my estimation, part critique of ideology, of this thing called fundamentalism, yes, part an intellectual history of Islamic philosophy, and part critical engagement with European philosophy and political strains from Europe and the United States, yes, having to do with fundamentalism most specifically, and among other things. Before we get into the book, Robert, I was hoping we might begin with a brief biological sketch of Wahba, this formidable thinker. Who is Mourad Wahba, and can you tell us a bit about his work and its importance in philosophy?
Sure. Well, Professor Mourad Wahba, he's still alive. He's in his 90s, so we're still in touch. He's an emeritus professor at the Ain Shams University. Ain Shams University in Egypt is considered, we don't have something like Ivy League, but it's like at that level. So it'd be the equivalent of that. It's a public university, but it's pretty prestigious. And he was a professor of philosophy there most of his career. He authored something like more than 20 books on philosophy and politics. Um, and he doesn't have a lot of things in English. He obviously writes in Arabic, and I thought it was important to translate him because, if you don't translate someone like Mourad Wahba, a philosopher from North Africa, people will not read him. They won't learn Arabic to read him. So I thought, it was kind of a responsibility for me to do that. And finally, he's actually the founder of the Afro-Asian Philosophy Association, which is a pretty important organization that did a lot of important work in the global South, bringing together philosophers from Africa and Asia to discuss important issues.
And you just mentioned this task of translating, and you kind of felt a responsibility. I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit. What drew you to his work initially, and really what made you decide to embark on this translation?
Yeah, so many, I think I came across his book, الأصولية والعلمانية, Fundamentalism and Secularization in Arabic, when I was doing research for my dissertation. So I did my dissertation on sort of the theoretical relationship between terrorism and Islamophobia. And that basically my first book is on that, decolonial psychoanalysis. And I think my dad actually sent me one of his articles to read. My father is a filmmaker and an intellectual, and he sends me stuff to read, and I read that, and I was like, wow, I thought it was quite original. Wahba's theorization of the dialectical or organic relationship between fundamentalism and capitalism, which I thought kind of opened my eyes to a whole take that could use for thinking about terrorism and Islamophobia. So that's how it began. That was probably around maybe 2016, 2017, something like that. And so it started with translating passages, sentences from the book to include in my work. And then I was like, the more I read, I was like, I might as well just translate the whole thing. Right. So I'm not a translator by trade or anything. It's more like out of frustration with the fact that folks in the English speaking world will not take this philosopher seriously, or will not consider his work, because he would be invisible or non-existent if he's not translated. So then that's kind of like when I felt this urgency, and it was a struggle to find a publisher that would be interested, because obviously because of this problem, right? They don't know who he is, even though I tried to make the point that he's as important as like any important philosopher today, right? But just because you don't know him doesn't mean he's not important. But obviously, if I was translating someone as problematic as Heidegger or whatever, no publisher would be like giving me a hard time, right? But it wasn't easy. It was like a probably two-year long process, 2 to 3 years, just to find the right publisher and all of that. And of course, I worked closely with Wahba, translating the book and sending him drafts and getting his feedback. And then, so he was pretty pleased with the result in the process.
Yeah, you mentioned in the foreword of this text, which you wrote, that Waba really praised your translation. Well, you didn't put it in those terms. It was more humble the way you phrased it, of course. But the message is clear that he was very pleased with the translation, and he really praised you for this effort. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so he wrote something like, he actually asked me to he wrote like a paragraph saying that he considers me a co-author, but like it was that good of a translation that he considered me a co-author. And he asked me to put that on the back of the book. I've asked the publishers. I mean, it wasn't my will, my desire, but I've asked the publisher, and publishers said no. They're like, we're not gonna do that. They just wanted the traditional blurbs on the back from different philosophers. But
including Lewis Gordon, actually.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
The reason I picked Lewis Gordon is, I tried to think about philosophers that write in English that actually are more familiar with philosophers in the global South, and Lewis Gordon actually cites Wahba and some of his work. So I was like, it's not going to be hard to convince him to endorse this.
Right. No, that's very good. It's quite the endorsement as well. So let me just say, as a friend, Robert, congratulations on this text.
Thank you so much.
And it's a wonderful read. And let's dive in actually to some of the arguments that Wahba is making. Let's start with this idea of fundamentalism. What for Wahba is fundamentalism exactly?
That's a good question. So fundamentalism, I guess one quick way of defining it would be to think of it as also dogmatism. Another way he defines it specifically, he says thinking of what is relative in absolute terms. Essentially, fundamentalism, and he's thinking from a kind of an epistemological perspective. Where he's really interested is like how we know things, and that's really the realm that he's operating from. And so, as an approach to knowledge, it's an absolutist approach. So basically, the fundamentalist would think that they know the absolute truth, and they operate in the world on that basis. So every action that they take will be on the basis of that sort of false premise, right? And so for Wahba, he doesn't reject the idea that there is an absolute truth. I think where he is a little bit Kantian, he thinks that it's something that's much more open to interpretation. So there's not one individual or one group of people that would have somehow privileged access to that. That's where he's more of an epistemic relativist, right?
Right.
Yeah. And there are features of fundamentalism that he talks about, such as a literalist approach. So fundamentalists tend to be very literalist in how they approach the so-called absolute truth. He calls the fundamentalists, one of his phrases is the bearers of the absolute truth. In Arabic, ملاك الحقيقة المطلقة. And he has a book actually with that specific title. So it's a theme for him that he's been, tackling throughout his work. The other thing is, it's basically how you approach the absolute truth, or how do you talk about the sacred, and how does that inform politics and all of that. So ultimately, it tends to be a conservative approach. It tends to be one that closes debate and dialogue, one that typically ends up leading toward violence, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, and a couple of so the philosophical justification for Waba's definition, I guess, which you just stated. If you could restate it for us, actually, the thinking of
thinking of what is relative in absolute terms.
Right. He also calls that fundamentalism the negation of interpretation.
Yes.
And the negation of this thing called secularization, which we'll get into in a minute.
Yeah.
Part of the labor of this text also seems to be the unmooring the term fundamentalism from its ideological and lexical attachment with Islam.
Yes, exactly.
And he's doing this in 1995.
Right.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that labor in this context.
Yeah, so I mean, he does talk about religious fundamentalism in general, and then he analyzes Christian fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, and Jewish fundamentalism, because obviously the Abrahamic faiths are very relevant for North Africa and West Asia, that whole region. But he says that this fundamentalism can extend to other religions, but also to even the secular world. So I do talk about technological fundamentalism or scientism as another way of being an absolutist or a dogmatist. So it's not reducible to religion, but it tends to be pretty prominent in the religious form, and it's not exclusive to Islam. In fact, he does talk about Edmund Burke as kind of the key theorist of fundamentalism, right? With his reflections on the revolution from 1790. So as a sort of elitist, conservative, monarchist rejection of what the revolution stands for, and the Enlightenment and secularization. And so a lot of what we see today in terms of new conservatism and the alt-right kind of could be traced back to that. So in many ways, he sees maybe Islamic fundamentalism emulating the Christian fundamentalist form, and which for him actually is the more prominent form of religious fundamentalism.
Right, and he draws this sort of lineage from Edmund Burke to Russell Kirk to the moral majority movement
Exactly.
in the 1980s.
Exactly.
And so it's important, I think, for our listeners and viewers to understand that his use of the term fundamentalism is quite diverse. And he exposes a kind of diversity of fundamentalisms.
Yes.
And he really critically indicts the fundamentalist movement leading up to the Reagan era.
Yeah.
Did you want to say a little more about that?
Yeah, so I think that's the most fascinating aspect. Obviously, the context of thinking about the alt-right today.
Yeah.
And because I have written about terrorism and Islamophobia, so obviously new conservatism is a big aspect of it too. I've written in the book about Adam Curtis's documentary, The Power of Nightmares, which kind of confirms Wahba's thesis about this dialectical relationship between what he calls parasitic capitalism and religious fundamentalism. And you really see this in The Power of Nightmares, wherein you have the neoconservatives, the Christian fundamentalists on one side, fighting, clashing with the Islamic fundamentalists on the other side. But ultimately, they're two sides of the same ideological coin, and they're just it's a clash of absolutes, and it's a paradoxical situation as Wahba sees it, because you can only have one absolute. So how can you have multiple absolutes? And that's the problem of fundamentalism. So it's not a clash of civilizations. He would reject that, right? He would think that there's one civilization, multiple cultures, but it's a clash of absolutes, right? And so this analysis that ties it with parasitic capitalism, I think, is pretty illuminating too. Not thinking that it's East versus West, or civilization versus barbarism, and all these kind of very facile characterizations that don't really look at the genealogy and history. So I think really by tracing it back to the 70s, where he kind of situates it with the rise of neoliberalism. So I mean, that's parasitic capitalism is his term for neoliberalism. That's how I interpret it. Financialization, this idea that you no longer have to produce in terms of capital accumulation. You can just make money without producing anything,
right,
which is basically the dominant form of capitalism. And that basically that form does have a dialectical relationship with fundamentalism as a sort of other form. So there might be some discourses about, against terrorism and all, or for democracy and freedom, but ultimately it's all just a game, because the ultimate dynamics are that fundamentalism and parasitic capitalism go hand in hand, right? They kind of have this kind of codependent, toxic relationship.
Right. And he also folds into that mix, and I think we'll talk about it once after we talk about secularization, but parasitic capitalism with postmodernism as well.
Yes.
Which is more towards the end of the book, but I'll
Yes.
ask you maybe that in a moment. You mentioned a clash of absolutes, which is a phrase that I think is wonderful in his argument. He says the clash of absolutes cannot be reconciled with the call for world peace, and as you just mentioned, that the paradox is that the multiplicity of absolutes is threatening these very absolutes. So there's something fragile here.
Yes.
Going on with fundamentalism. It seems to be kind of fundamentally on unstable grounds as it is.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentalism, in his view, will only lead to violence and instability, and this thing that we call terrorism. We can analyze that without understanding how it does arise from fundamentalism and that it is sustained by parasitic capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, you can't remove terrorism, you can't reduce violence in the world without addressing fundamentalism, which is ultimately beneficial to and kind of sustained by parasitic capitalism. And this is where his analysis is very dialectical and materialist,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
And even Leninist in a way.
And Leninist, yeah.
One of his formulations, maybe you have it more closer to mind than I do, it kind of echoes Lenin on on monopoly capitalism.
Yeah. Something like terrorism being the last stage of fundamentalism or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
highest stage of fundamentalism,
Or the
right?
highest stage, yeah. So yeah, so I sort of extend his analysis to think about, yeah, that relationship. Lenin thinks about imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. And then he thinks, Mourad Wahba, that terrorism is the highest stage of fundamentalism. So if we, combine both formulations, it does shine a light on the current situation to understand, well, what is the relationship between capitalism, fundamentalism, terrorism, imperialism, and postmodernism? And they're
Mm-hmm.
somehow connected in a network. And his analysis reveals a lot of those connections.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And your translation obviously elucidates those. I think that's something you add. Is this maybe a focus on the aspect of parasitic capitalism? Perhaps. Um, let's switch now over to what his solution,
Yeah.
Waba's solution, which comes in the form of this concept of secularization, which
Yeah.
is different from secularism. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and that's sort of the touchy topic here. So secularism, I think why it is seen as colonial, because it's assumed that it's implicitly a Christian secularism. That's always the assumption that it's the Christian form of secularism, and there's truth to that, and that's why we have to make that distinction, right? So secularism, in that sense, would be an ideology that pretends to be secular, but ultimately, in a sense, is religious,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it is the Christian form of secularism. Whereas secularization for Wahba is a process, it's an imperfect process, it's an ongoing process. And ultimately, its goal or horizon would be something democratic and socialist, right? Because ultimately, he is critiquing parasitic capitalism, so he is for something that would be like revolutionary socialism.
Mm-hmm.
He is critiquing religious fundamentalism, so he cannot replace it with another form of ideology under the name of secularism, right? So secularization for him is thinking of what is relative in relative terms. Ultimately, that would be thinking of the social or the political, because that's really what this is about. It's like you have the absolute truth. This is the realm of the sacred, the realm of religion. How do you then apply this or think about it in terms of the social or the political? And this is where it gets very complicated, and you have a lot of fundamentalist assumptions. Sort of a good example would be like, how do you ask is supposed to be secular, and yet there's a phrase like "God bless America" that's used by politicians all the time, or the idea that in court you raise your hand on the Bible and things like that. So all these examples, all these symbols show that the form of secularism in the U.S. is a Christian form, a Protestant form, but it's not what Wahba has in mind precisely, which is uh, his commitment is to interpretation. That's ultimately the big concept for him, the big methodology. So secularization is very much tied to interpretation. So this idea that any text is open to interpretation, whether it's sacred or not, that basically, the fundamentalist opposition would be that to be literalist, to be against interpretation, that there's one solution, that there's one interpretation, not multiple ones. And so that's basically his understanding. It's sort of a more interested in hermeneutics, more interested in dialogue, more interested in maybe radical democracy, um, and yeah, and less interested in um, dogmatism, that would lead to violence and instability, etc.
Right. And you just mentioned interpretation is kind of a, maybe even it's an axiom. If there's
Yeah.
something axiomatic in his thought in this text, it's the role of interpretation, the necessity. He calls it everyone's right at a certain time after secularization, this process. And he puts a lot of weight on the work of Averroes,
Yes.
and he puts him in the same tradition as Luther and the Reformation and the Enlightenment, although, of course, predating
Yeah.
each of these things significantly. Can you talk a little bit about Averroes?
Yeah. So Averroes in Arabic known as Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Rushd was an Andalusian philosopher. He was a judge, and he was an Aristotelian. Ernest Bloch considers him part of the Aristotelian left and maybe one of the key figures in that formulation. But basically, his approach, Ibn Rushd's approach, was to go back to Aristotle, go back to the classics, but through an Islamic lens, and also interpret Islam through the lens of ancient Greek philosophy, especially logic. And so there's this possibility of interpretation. So, in the history of Islamic philosophy, there are multiple schools of thought and multiple, many philosophers. And I think the problem that we're at, and this is the problem that Wahba identifies, that there's one school of thought that kind of dominated and has been um, dealt with as the one representative of Islam or Islamic philosophy. And that's a line that goes back to this thinker called Ibn Taymiyyah, and then to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. So Wahhabism as a
Mhm.
concept, right? The official ideology of Saudi Arabia goes back to that specific thinker. And that's a tradition that's against interpretation. It's a tradition that it's a fundamentalist tradition that looks at the sacred text as, not open to interpretation, and that to do so would be illegitimate and illegal and not allowed, etc. And so, but the history of Islam, when you look at it, has so many other voices and so many other traditions that are pretty rich. And Ibn Rushd is one example of that, as someone that didn't see a contradiction between religion and philosophy, saw them being in dialogue and actually enriching one another. In fact, he viewed that the philosopher is the closest you can get to God in a way on earth.
Right. Says
So,
his Aristotelianism is kind of coming out
right.
there, right? Yeah.
Right, absolutely. So and so Wahba belongs to that tradition, this Averroes tradition of the importance of philosophy, the importance of interpretation, and of course Ibn Rushd had a huge influence on the Renaissance because, as you know, during medieval times, uh, the medieval scholars came across Ibn Rushd's translations in Arabic of Aristotle, and then they were translated to other languages after that, and that led to a whole boom in terms
Right.
of universities and the education of the humanities and all of that. And that's one of the pillars of the Renaissance, was that translation movement and also interpretation, because sometimes the Islamic philosophers are just reduced to just being translators of Greek philosophy, but they
Mhm.
they would translate and then they have their commentaries and interpretations. So those were also as important as the translations themselves.
Mhm.
So yeah, so basically he does have a quote in there. Let me see if I can find it. Where he cites Ibn Rushd's
Oh yeah,
definition of interpretation. Do you have that one?
I've got it right here actually. Yeah.
Can you read it?
Extending of the significance of an expression from real to metaphorical significance.
Yeah, so that's pretty interesting definition and quite open. And
Mhm.
obviously, if you're Lacanian, you could like read too much into it. Uh, the concept of the real and all that. But
Right.
basically, this idea that the text is not fixed and that the text is dialectical, that the text requires a reader.
Mhm.
And so this idea of fundamentalism is that the text somehow does not need the reader. So the fundamentalist acts as if basically they're speaking on behalf of God directly. And that's ultimately the problem of any fundamentalist position, whether religious or otherwise.
Right. And that's maybe why you use the formulation to talk about Waba as an epistemic relativist rather than a moral relativist in his indictment and his critique of fundamentalism. He's not proposing a moral sort of framework here.
No,
He's really talking about interpretation and epistemology fundamentally, which I found
absolutely.
quite striking in terms of the construction of this argument. Did you want to speak to that a little bit, or shall I?
Yeah, I mean, you said it perfectly, but you know, he does not make any he does not reject the idea of the absolute truth. But for him, again, it's a Kantian position that's like a noumenon that exists out there. But the role of scientists and philosophers is to try to use science and philosophy to know what that is, and that's always going to be uncertain, and we're going to learn more and more about it, but it's an open-ended thing. Whereas, so yeah, but it's not a moral framework. It is an epistemic framework.
Which really makes it strong, I think, in terms
Yeah.
of philosophical argument. And he makes another argument towards the end of the book about the relationship, perhaps even the direct connection between fundamentalism and postmodernism. I thought, upon my first reading, that it was a bit laconic and though compelling. But I wonder, maybe you could maybe even educate me better on this link, because it is a very compelling comparison he's making.
Well, I mean, if we think about it historically, again, I think that's one way of making it more concrete and less abstract. So you have those three main concepts, right? Parasitic capitalism, religious fundamentalism, postmodernism, the three coordinates of the book. He's talking about the rise of neoliberalism since the 70s, with Chile, the experiments that were done in New York City that then become formalized with Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s, right? And that eventually give rise to neoconservatism. So in a sense, you're seeing the intellectual history and historical context that allows for all of this. You're also seeing at the same time the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and Christian fundamentalism, or them becoming more popular as political forms around the same time, right? And of course, we have to say this in the context of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s. The Ronald Reagan administration supports the Mujahideen tactically to attack the communists. And of course, this alliance works, but then it backfires because the Mujahideen end up becoming Taliban or Al-Qaeda, right? And so that's the historical context. And it's also the historical context of postmodernism, right? All the major texts about that and theorizations of the culture. So you can see the parallels around the same time, 70s and 80s, parasitic capitalism. So there's that concrete element to it, is that he's trying to understand from the perspective of the 90s, mid-90s in Egypt, all of those things coming together, influencing what's happening in Egypt in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the replacement of the Red Scare with the Green Peril, right? All of those dynamics, and he's trying to analyze that political situation using philosophy, right? So the postmodern piece really, I think the best text that he kind of focuses on is Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation. And this is really the key, if you want to think like the Rosetta Stone. That's it, because she's against interpretation, and fundamentalists are also against interpretation. Now, they might have some differences, whereas they are more literalist. The postmodernists might not be, but this everything goes approach, where you're skeptical about interpretation as too authoritative and perhaps too authoritarian, perhaps being a grand narrative, right? That it's too colonial or too imperial. You're rejecting interpretation. Well, what are you left with if you're rejecting interpretation? Well, then you're aligning in a bizarre way with the fundamentalists. So that's the situation that he's analyzing. And that's why he says they're dialectically related. Doesn't mean that they're exactly the same, but there's some kind of relationship that's strange. They're while they might seem like they're not on the same camp, they're kind of sustaining one another from a distance. And that's why we can think of terrorism as a postmodern phenomenon in that sense. right? Because it's the combination of all these things coming together.
Well, that's a really wonderful gloss of this chapter in the book, I think, and it really, I think, helps me understand it a little better. And I notice now that just how nuanced Wahba's language is when he's critiquing postmodernism, and you just put it as a dialectical relationship with fundamentalism. It's not subsumed by fundamentalism as such. They maintain an organic material connection. For instance, at the end of that chapter called Postmodernism and Fundamentalism, he presents a conclusion in the form of a conditional statement. If rejecting interpretation is a distinctive sign of postmodernism, then one can say that there is an organic relationship between postmodernism and religious fundamentalism to the extent that religious fundamentalism rejects interpreting the religious text because it adheres to its literality. So this is perfectly summarizes, I think,
Yeah.
how you just put that.
And honestly, I see a lot of connections between his thinking and psychoanalysis.
Mm. Can you
Because if
talk
you
about
think
that a
about,
little bit?
well, if you think about psychoanalysis as sort of a modern, like the best example of a modern field, right?
Mm.
Its key method is interpretation, right?
Mhm.
Like the magnum opus of Freud's magnum opus is the interpretation of dreams. It's this idea that things can be interpreted as opposed to not, right? Which is, may not seem that radical, but in Wahba's view and in my view, it might be the most radical thing that if we don't have this ability to interpret things, and I guess it is a humanistic
Mhm.
sort of presumption in a sense that you need an interpreter in order for interpretation to happen. In other words, it's not going to be an AI performing the interpretation, right? Where it's just what's happening today,
Right.
supposedly. That, and we can think about the fundamentalism of that, right? The
Mhm.
technological fundamentalism of AI, right? And how it fits in within this whole model. So this is where his analysis could be used to analyze contemporary phenomenon like that.
Right, and you even put it in the forward, if I'm not mistaken. You say something about this text possibly being more relevant today than ever before. Perhaps it's
Yes,
first because of some of these reasons. Uh, Specifically, though, you cite the alt-right, and
yes,
Waba's term in the 1990s was, of course, the new right, and
yes.
neoconservatism that you just mentioned in the 1970s and 80s. But how could we use this text, Robert, to talk about the rise of the alt-right, um, some of these things we're seeing in the United States and abroad in terms of religious fundamentalism and parasitic capitalism?
I think the first thing is historicization, because obviously you started this podcast with interviewing Dr. Gerald Horn, who's like a fantastic historian. So you clearly are dedicated to understanding things historically, which
Mm-hmm.
which is the key thing. So was studying, when I began researching Islamophobia and terrorism, these are great terms to think about in terms of how they're usually looked at ahistorically.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, terrorism could be seen like as a recent phenomenon that doesn't have a history. Whereas when you like look at the history, it's actually has a long history and it could be subdivided. In my book, I go into that, right? The same thing you can do with Islamophobia. You can say, well, if you're not really familiar with the history, you'll say, well, it's something that's post 9/11 and
Mm-hmm.
just reduce it to that. But
Right.
obviously it predates that and has a long history and has connections to Orientalism, etc. So it's the same idea. Like what he does with fundamentalism and secularization as concepts is that he historicizes them, right? That's what you were talking about, the intellectual histories. So so there's a sense where, yeah, he's interested in philosophically in these concepts, politically, but he has to also understand what is their lineage. So we understand this alt-right doesn't come out of the blue. There
Mm-hmm.
had to be a new right, there had to be a moral majority movement, and then they have their foundation in Edmund Burke's kind of way of thinking, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
rejecting the French Revolution and the radicalism that it sort of opens up. This idea, that you could be changing things quickly. Because like the whole thing about conservatism is conserving tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Conserving the way things we've always was doing things. Whereas radicalism is about change, right? So that's scary because, if you're a conservative, you're happy with how things are. In fact, things were better before. right?
Right.
Make America great again, because it
Right.
was great already. Let's make it great again. And
Hmm.
of course, that's, Donald Trump's slogan is a repeat of Reagan's. When you go back to Reagan's slogans, it's "Make America Great," and Donald Trump just added again, I
Right.
think. So
Right.
it's just first as a tragedy, then as a farce, right?
Right. Or a repetition compulsion,
Right, right.
form of death drive, perhaps.
So I think that's very helpful to analyze conservatism historically, and thinking about those shifts and situating it in that way. And the same thing with secularization. And again, thinking about secularization as a process that's endogenous to whatever tradition or
Mhm.
culture, so that you can have different forms of secularization, that there isn't one form that's called secularism, that Europe is going to be like, here's how it's done, and apply this to your part of the world. That's what we should reject, because like that's the model we see in France with laïcité,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
That form of secularism that basically is very Islamophobic,
Mhm.
right? It's okay with almost everything except Islam and any symbols that remind the public of Islam,
Mhm.
right? And that comes from the guilt of France's colonization of North Africa,
Mhm.
right? So those reminders remind France of that. So they'd rather just repress that, right? Negate that, and so that's kind of a very symptomatic form of secularism, and that's not what we want. And that's why Wahba talks about it in terms of a process, and it's a process that arises from whatever tradition that you belong to. So what I like about his approach, and I think about this especially for global Southern thinkers like myself and like him, it's kind of a double work that we have to do. We have to study European philosophy, and we also have to study our own tradition and then think about how the two come together. And that's the
Mhm.
kind of work that he does, the complex work he does. He's not only familiar with European philosophy and history and all of that, because you cannot be acting as if that didn't happen, or that somehow didn't have an influence on you as someone living in Egypt. That's, it's relevant. You can just reject everything as colonial, because that's just
Right.
irrational,
Mhm.
right? And that's kind of important. So he's not an anti-modernist in that sense. I do frame him as a transmodernist. He doesn't like that framing, but I do think of him that way because that double work that he does,
Mhm.
where he is engaging with Arab Islamic philosophy and tradition in dialogue with the European tradition and philosophy, and thinking about the modernism of both uh, traditions. And so his vision of secularization, the wrong way to read him would be that he's just being co-opted by European way of thinking, right? And
Mhm.
he's just repeating that model of secularism. That's like the shallow reading of someone that wouldn't carefully read his work. But I think he does offer us something that's pretty deep and complex, and that I don't see many voices out there in leftist or intellectual milieus that kind of bring that point.
I mean, certainly the way you're putting it now, when I think back to reading, especially some of those final chapters, when he's recounting the intellectual history of philosophy in North Africa,
Hmm.
which is a chapter that I think was an essay that you chose to
Yeah.
attach to this work and
Yes.
print alongside this fundamentalism and secularization. He treats, for instance, those thinkers, Al-Afghani, for instance, with the same depth he treats Kant and Hegel
Exactly.
in the main body of the text, alongside this rich historical description and this
Yes.
rich philosophical epistemological argument. It's really quite
Yes.
striking, I have to say.
And if we think of Ibn Rushd is like his biggest influence, by the way. So, um, what Ibn Rushd embodies is again this double work. Ibn Rushd is Muslim. He's a practicing Muslim. He's an Islamic judge. And he's an Aristotelian, and he's a philosopher. It's not an either or,
Right.
right? Wahba is the same way. He's very proud of the Arab Islamic tradition and philosophy, and he studies it very well. What he has a problem with, and when it's reduced to one line of thought, or some thinkers as representative of the whole tradition, which
Mm-hmm.
is the kind of problem that we have today. And this is the problem of fundamentalism,
Exactly.
which reduces multiplicity to oneness, right? To an absolute.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's very well said. Um, maybe you can speak a little more about, you just mentioned the laïcité
Yeah.
in France, but concurrently, right now in the United States, we are seeing this sort of fundamentalist upswell. Certainly,
Yes.
we could go on. We could go on all day rattling off names and occasions. So I'll just name a few for the listeners who on this channel are already very familiar with what I'm about to say. But you've got a fundamentalism arising in the legal proceedings in the judiciary in Florida, for instance, under Ron DeSantis, the Supreme Court in the United States, clearly, executive orders coming out of Arkansas against banning explicitly critical race theory in public schools.
Yeah.
You've got absolutist religious and white supremacist positions proliferating ideologically and at the legal levels in this country, but also abroad in the AfD in Germany, Modi in India,
Mm-hmm.
which has seen some of our colleagues face backlash for some of their research and some of their ideas. And of course, we are living with, you mentioned Trump and Make America Great Again, which is a serious threat as well. We also live in an age of conspiracy, conspiracy thinking, conspiracy theory. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this current situation and some of Waba's thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, the context of the new right that he wrote about was the Cold War, right? Today, with the legal attacks on critical race theory from Republican lawmakers in the US, a fringe right-wing conspiracy theory called cultural Marxism, right? Unfortunately, is becoming more and more mainstream. This non-theory, as I like to call it, because it shouldn't deserve that signifier as theory, because that's kind of respecting it too much, right?
Right.
It posits a cultural war waged by non-whites, particularly indigenous and black folks, and non-Christians, Jews and Muslims, using the ideological weaponry of Frankfurt School critical theory. That's a conspiracy. It is, of course, ridiculous, but it enacts this return of the repressed, the return of Samuel P. Huntington's thesis, the clash of civilizations, a clash that supposedly is a historical clash that goes back to the Crusades, of course. And, you know, George Bush indexed it when I was analyzing his speeches. When he was referring to the war on terror, he actually said, this crusade. So, you know, this is the unconscious of these conservatives, is obviously a false history, false ideas that are considered theories. And I don't know why we say conspiracy theory. We should just say conspiracy, right? So obviously Wahba, as we talked about, regards this as a clash of absolutes, not a clash of civilizations. And for him, there's only one human civilization in many cultures. And I think this message, you know, we should pause on this a little bit, because we tend to think in this very divided way. And this is, again, the humanism at the heart of his work. One human civilization. So that means that the philosophies of India, China, of Greece, of Egypt, they're all part of the human civilization, and that we should all be curious about this and learn from that, as opposed to thinking that it's a clash of civilizations and all that nonsense, right? And thinking of East versus West and all of that, right? It doesn't help anyone, that kind of way of thinking. So he represents, with his work, with who he is, as a human being, as a philosopher, this possibility of thinking the human in a global, cosmopolitan way. Of course, these figures that you mentioned cannot think this way because they're nationalistic, they're fascistic, right? So they're not able to even think of the human. And because they can't think of the human, they dehumanize, right? So that's the problem of not thinking of one human civilization and thinking of civilizations clashing. Then the civilization that one belongs to becomes the human one, and then everything else is the barbarism, right? Is the savagery. So that's the sort of binarism that they're operating from, and this binarism that Wahba rejects. I think that there has to be a clash, there has to be a dialectic, but we have to be clear about who the enemy is and what we're critiquing, right? So and that's why he gives us that focus on fundamentalism and fundamentalists, right? This is the thing, and they come in many shapes and colors, right? It could be the Christian fundamentalists, Republican lawmakers, but it could be the technological fundamentalists of AI today. It could be the Elon Musks of the world, right? It could be the Bezos of the world. So fundamentalism comes in many shapes and forms, right? And this should be the focus, I think, of our critique, because that's the thing that leads to violence. That's the thing that leads to wars, right? This approach to politics. He talks about it in terms of literalizing the sacred, or the theologization of politics as well. That's another phrase that he uses. And this is very true. This theologization of politics means that the politician, in a sense, is a representative of God. And because they are a representative of God, they can do anything. Like, it's the old idea of sovereignty. So if you think about it from the perspective of like DeSantis, if he is really convinced with what he's saying, and I think he probably is, his Christian fundamentalism leads him that he is not just representing a constituency, he's actually represented God, and he's working on behalf of God. So it's a righteous crusade, right? And that's what Wahba is critiquing, is when you have politics on that basis, you're going to have all these kind of problems that we're seeing today, all this racism, all this anti-radicalism, right? All this exploitation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And he calls secularization a solution.
Yeah.
And then you further that in your preface to this book by describing his dialectical approach. And you claim that he means something like the radical left. Can you talk a little bit about the solution to some of these to this political front that we're facing, this fundamentalist front that we're facing? How can secularization usher in a new way of political thinking? How do we approach this practically?
Yeah, I think he has a quote in there where he says, parasitic capitalism devours what is against science and reason. That is everything that leads to absent-mindedness, right? And so the key words there being science and reason. Science, of course, is, again, going back to this idea of knowledge. It's not just natural science, but it's this dedication to learning and to knowledge, which, you know, anyone that's really into philosophy or academia should be dedicated or passionate about that, right? Supposedly. And then reason, right? There's a deep connection between fascism and irrationalism, right? So if we reject reason, if we reject the possibility for interpretation and dialogue, what are we left with? Someone saying, well, this is how it is, and you have to believe it, and that's that, right? And then you have something like Nazism or any form that looks like that. So ultimately, I see his work as being for reason, for science, being anti-fascist, being liberatory. In a sense, it has a socialist horizon. But Wahba's history is that, you know, in the beginning of his career, he worked very closely to President Nasser.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so his political roots are very radical, and of course he struggled a lot under Sadat's presidency, because Sadat was the one that introduced sort of what he called you know, open door capitalism, or you know, he reversed all the policies of Nasser, all the socialist policies, and the nationalization and all of that, and wanted Egypt to be neoliberal, basically. And so during that era, Wahba was, you know, not welcome to really speak, and he was limited politically in many ways, right? And then they ended up finding him more useful, like politically, from the regime's perspective, when terrorism became like a real problem in the country. And they're like, okay, well, we have to let him speak because otherwise, this problem is it's just gonna continue. So then they kind of give him more room to speak, etc. So that already reveals a lot, that whole history and about his political commitments and what he's thinking. If we're talking about interpretation, you can go from that to democracy, right? Because you wouldn't have democracy without interpretation. You wouldn't have dialogue without interpretation. So that's the inherent connection there. If you have literalism, there's no way you're going to have democracy. You're only going to have an authoritarian form of government, right? And that's why, like Saudi Arabia as an example, they have this marriage between Wahhabism as an ideological approach to Islam that's literalist. That's one approach to Islam that became the dominant one that supports the absolute monarchy regime of Saudi Arabia. So in a sense, what this reveals is the importance of philosophical ideas. Is ultimately you can just think of politics without thinking about philosophy, because politicians use philosophical ideas even if they don't know. I think that's the interesting part. Like, for example, this idea that this Ibn Taymiyyah line of thinking that leads all the way to terrorism, which is the line that's against interpretation. That line sometimes is presented as the only line, as if there is no history and there is no philosophy and that there's no multiplicity of voices, right? But there's always someone being indexed. There's always an idea being used. So that means philosophy is important. It's just what kind of philosophy, right? So obviously the philosophies that are winning a lot of times are these conservative fundamentalist philosophies that are very attractive because if you feel like you're the bearer of the absolute truth, obviously it's going to make you feel very powerful, as sort of, there's God and then there's you. So you can imagine like how it attracts megalomaniac leaders and figures, right? And that's really at the heart of it. So there's no humility in that. But we can have alternative politics based on other kinds of philosophies and other kinds of ideas. So we have to show that possibility and talk about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that was very, very well said. And it reveals a lot. I didn't know that about Wahba. That's really interesting, his political history. I think it does reveal a lot about this work in particular. And you characterize him, and this characterization you have of him as a world philosopher. He's really a philosopher of the world because he engages with so many histories and so many disciplinary approaches, and he really treats them with a lot of charity, even while he's kind of taking them down. Some of these fundamental. I mean, he's doing a very sophisticated form of immanent critique on every one of these fundamentalisms.
He reads the conservatives closely, and he cites them, and he shows the fallacies of their logic, and that's very important. You have to be able to show that, so that the reader can decide, what makes sense and what doesn't. And I think that's important.
It shows his influence, Averroes's influence on him, I think, in that capacity.
Yes, he definitely got the methodology from Averroes. And I have some good news to share with you as well. I've been overseeing other translations. So obviously, as a human being who's limited in terms of time and energy, I can't do everything. But I have asked some colleagues to translate other works by him.
Oh, good.
So there are two other works that are in translation as we speak.
Oh, wow.
At different stages of completion. One is called The Paradox of Ibn Rushd. So it's a book just about Ibn Rushd. And that one is supposed to come out with Gerlach Press in Germany. There is, and that's being translated by Mayi Kozba. And then another one called Introduction to the Enlightenment. It's kind of a tricky title because when you hear it, you think, well, it's going to just be another book about the Enlightenment. But it's Introduction to the Enlightenment from the perspective of Egypt and North Africa and the Global South. So in other words, how philosophers in North Africa imported those ideas and applied them and changed what they mean. So the title doesn't capture that, but that's what the book is really about. And that one is being translated by Ziad al-Nabulsi, and it's in negotiation now in terms of the contract and all that. So
Oh, great.
yeah, so we should have 2 more texts hopefully coming out within the next 2 years. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was going to ask what the plans were because I know that he has so many books that have yet to be
Yes,
translated. In fact,
absolutely.
is this the first to be translated? I'm actually not sure.
This is the first official one.
Ah,
He has a book in English that's an co-edited collection on Averroes and the Enlightenment.
mhm.
But I think this is the first official English translation
Wow.
to
So
be
this is
published. Yeah,
a very big moment, and it's just going to lead to more exposure of this
that's the idea.
fascinating thinker.
Yeah, that's the idea. And he was very happy, and he just represents the idea that there are thinkers in the non-European world who are doing important work that we need to be familiar with.
Mhm. I could ask a couple final questions if you have time, Robert.
Sure.
One of them, you've kind of mentioned some of this as you've been discussing his work and your role in translating his work. How does Mourad Wahba's work inform your critical praxis, your aesthetic praxis, your research? You mentioned psychoanalysis.
Mhm.
How is this philosophy informative for you as a thinker?
That's a great question. I think this humanist commitment to world philosophy or worldliness in general is something that's very inspiring to me. So I do have I think it's kind of a rare position because a lot of people think in a binary way. It's like either, right, like think of something like modernity. It's either you agree with it fully and you become someone like, Christopher Hitchens or something like that, and or you completely reject it and you're someone like Sayyid Qutb who thinks of the Enlightenment as ignorance, as jahiliyyah, as that Islam is the solution and we should completely reject modernity. So you have these 2 alternatives, and it's like an either or situation. Either you go with modernity, and if you do, then you're colonial, and or either reject modernity completely, and that's the decolonial approach.
Mhm.
So I reject both positions. Mourad Wahba rejects both positions. So we have to, modernity has a lot to teach us about historical reason, and there's a lot of value in that. And there are problematic parts that are attached to modernity that have to do with coloniality, and those are the parts that we need to critique and reject. We have to make that distinction. At the same time, there's a lot of interesting modern things we can learn from the non-European world, that just different way of thinking, different way of doing things. And we also have to reject the sort of irrational parts of the non-European world as well. So there's no like one quick solution for everything, right? Which is
Right.
usually what we see a lot, right? It's like, this is the answer, or this is the answer. So I see what he's doing is that's the kind of nuance that I look for, that you can engage with European philosophy, you can engage with Arab Islamic philosophy and be critical of both at the same time.
Right, which is exemplified perhaps in your other title, Freud and Said, which is another book maybe we should discuss on another occasion.
Sure.
So this clearly you folded this sort of worldview into your work, this sort of philosophy into your work already.
Yeah.
Um, maybe I can ask in closing, Robert, you just had a book come out that was uh, has been in the works for quite a number of years, if I'm not mistaken.
A psychoanalytic biography of Ye.
That's right.
Yeah, so I started work on that one in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a crazy journey because obviously, writing about someone like Ye who, is manic depressive to begin with, and then he had like a pretty strong fascist turn in 2022. Um, it's an emotional roller coaster, writing that book,
I
to
can,
say the least, right?
right.
Um, but yeah, It just got published recently, and I'm excited for people to read it. I put a lot of effort into it. Um, it's mostly a psychoanalytic take on that 5-year period from 2016 till 2021,
Mm.
which is a period that are called the shaky ass years. And that's the reason I focused on that period particularly. There's a lot that's written about Kanye as he used to be known before then, especially like, so many people talking about the sort of the graduation trilogy and all of that, the higher education trilogy and everything that came after that. But there wasn't a lot of serious attention and scholarly analysis of that period. It was a lot of just dismissive remarks. And it was, as someone who's a psychoanalyst and critical psychologist, and clearly he's someone who is struggling with manic depression, and he's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I just use the psychoanalytic older terminology, and I go into the reasoning behind that in the book. But he had a nervous breakdown in 2016 that was pretty public and visible, and that's what drew me to understand what's going on and interpret what's happening. And I've been hooked ever since, and it's been a rabbit hole, basically.
Wow. And
Yeah.
that's just was published. Is that right? It's already out.
Yeah, I think it came out, like early October or something like that. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like a really fascinating read, and maybe yet another book of yours that we'll have to meet and discuss as soon as I can find the time to read it.
Sure, sure.
Well, Robert, this was wonderful. It's so great to finally be able to sit down with you and talk about your work. We've been orbiting each other for so long in terms of doing something like this. So this is great that we finally were able to. Now's your chance to plug some of your other work, your music, and so on.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I do hope that the listeners will purchase the book and read it and engage with a philosopher from the global South. Yeah, my first passion is really the fine arts. I always say I'm a fine artist first, which people find that weird. In many ways, my scholarly career is there to support my artistic career, to be honest with you. Uh, which is weird. I was asking my wife yesterday, Coney, do you like more my artistic side, personality, or my scholarly side? And she's telling me like, do you want my honest answer? I was like, yeah. She's like, definitely the artistic side. So
That's a courageous question to ask.
yeah, I know.
And a courageous one to answer, I should also.
Well, my artistic side is much happier than the scholarly side. The nerdy scholarly side is like something I developed to survive our capitalist world. Because it's very hard to survive as an artist. But that's the kind of formula I ended up with, is to, and somehow maybe infuse the two. This is kind of what I'm trying to do also. Like I said the next two books are aesthetics. The Ye one is kind of a way of infusing the scholarly into the aesthetic to sort of combine both worlds. And I have another book, actually, I haven't announced it, so it'll be the first time I announce it here.
Oh, wow.
I have another book coming out, hopefully next year, on Yusuf Shaheen, his cinema, and on the philosophy of Ibn Rushd. So that's kind of continuing in the Wahhabian path a little bit.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for making us aware of that. That's very exciting. What a perfect trajectory to set up here.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So, congratulations on both of those.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm telling you, we're going to have to sit down and talk about Ye and talk about your music as well. Maybe we can talk.
I'll be happy to, and I know, you're like a big jazz person, so it'd be perfect to.
We'll set up another time.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Robert. This was great, and get the book. I read it 1.5 times. It's amazing. His translation is really, really amazing. That's all I can really say about it.
Thanks so much.
I just look forward to reading more here. So thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
you mentioned in your foreword that you really tried to pay close attention to the rhetoric and the logic that Waba was using, and your language is so lucid and the English is so lucid that, and with this, to clarify this extremely delicate and nuanced and sophisticated argument that he is making, I couldn't believe, I was blown away by the lucidity of this text as a translation.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of aspects. So one, like the Arabic that he uses is in a way formal and esoteric in some instances. So it was hard to really translate some of those things. But also the other thing about the Arabic language is that one word can mean multiple things, much more than in English. Whereas in English, you tend to have multiple words. In Arabic, it could be one word meaning 5 different things, and it's hard to determine exactly what it means. And sometimes there are words, and that's why transliteration is also important, and you see that I use that quite a bit. There are words that are very specific. A good example is the word deen. Deen, it's often translated as religion, but many scholars say that deen, especially in Islam, refers more to tradition. So it's a bigger concept than religion in the Christian way of thinking. So I think the bigger challenge was really not to impose concepts that come from either English-related cultures or Christian-related cultures, but to see if I can capture the specificity of Arab culture and things related to Islam, and somehow to be able to capture that without losing it. So that's really capturing those nuances. Another one was dawla, which is often mistranslated as state, but as I mentioned, it's like not as a concept. It even predates the state as a concept. So how can you say that it's state, right? The state as a concept, or especially the form of the nation state, is a much more recent concept. It's like a modern concept. But in Islam, they refer to dawla, and I think I compare it to a Greek concept that's related to cyclicity or change, and that's closer to the meaning. I ended up using governance as a way of compromise, but there are many struggles with specific terms that could have multiple meanings, or specific terms that mean something than what they would mean in English. And so that was really the challenge, is to be, as Walter Benjamin talks about in The Task of the Translator, closer to the spirit of the text and away from being literalist. Because ultimately it's a text against literalism. So I can't be literalist in my translation.
Right.
I have to be able to capture the spirit of the original text somehow.
You have to add that broken shard to the the vase. That's
right.
Well, no wonder he commended your translation and calls you a co-author. It makes a lot of sense, actually.
It was so nice of him, like unbelievable.